Thank you for joining today's webinar. Starting us off is Marcia Sailors. Marcia?
Partnerships in a changing global environment. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. First, I want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded. By joining this session, you automatically consent to such recording. If you do not consent, please disconnect from the webinar at this time. And also to let you know, today's webinar will be posted next week on our website at nts.edu/club-300. At the end of the webinar, we're going to ask you for some feedback survey regarding the event. The questions will appear in the right-hand panel under polling under the Q&A window. Once you have finished answering the questions, please hit submit. We're very grateful for your feedback. So now let's get started. I'd like to introduce to you today our moderator, NTS Alumni President, Dr. Carla Sundberg.
Thank you, Marcia. As Marcia mentioned, I'm Carla Sundberg, and I'll be your moderator today. And you've been invited to this webinar because of your generous support of NTS by way of the new Club 300. And we are really grateful for you joining the Club 300. We feel like this is an important way for NTS's alumni to become connected with the seminary. Most seminaries and universities across the country and the world have alumni who are engaged in supporting the institution. By Club 300, we're trying to engage our alumni to help support with at least $300 a year as being part of this Club 300. Part of that is to engage you in conversations like the one that we plan to have today. So thank you so much for being a part of it. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for your continued support of NTS. Now, as we move along today, I just want you to notice on your screen on the right-hand side there's a section that says Q&A. And it is in that box that you may type your questions as we are going through this meeting today. I'm going to be watching those questions, and there will be times when we take a break, and I'll probably be trying to kind of collect questions by topic, and as we have time, interjecting them into the conversation. So please feel free to put your questions in there, and then click send at the right-hand bottom of the box. Again, today our topic is Moving Beyond Toxic Charity, Building Effective Long-Term Mission Partnerships in a Changing Global Environment. And our speakers today are Dr. David Wesley, NTS Associate Professor of Intercultural Studies, and Dr. David Busick, NTS President. We are glad to have David and David here with us today. So to begin with, just to keep us confused, but Dr. David Busick is going to share with us a few words of welcome.
Thank you, Carla, and thank you to everybody for joining this webinar. We're delighted to have you, and we just want to say thank you so much for the way that our alumni are supporting the seminary. These are very good days at NTS, and as we go along throughout the next few months, we want to share more about that with you. And so a special thank you to you, and we hope that this webinar today is helpful to you. If you're a district superintendent, a pastor, whoever you may be, we want this to be very practical and also inspiring if the Lord would lead you into these kinds of partnerships. So thank you again, Carla.
Thank you, Dr. Busick. Now, I would like to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. David Wesley. Dr. Wesley recently finished his dissertation focused on global partnerships and will share with us his research focusing on the challenges in these types of partnerships with an emphasis on best practices. Dr. Busick is also joining us in the discussion, but through the context of his experience with Bethany First Church and their long-term mission project, which was in Swaziland. Again, please pose your questions to our presenters at any time using the Q&A feature, and I will be monitoring that throughout the morning and or the afternoon, depending on where you are. So, Dr. Wesley, I now turn it over to you.
Thank you. It's good to be with everyone. Let me just begin by saying that this is an ongoing conversation that Dave and I have been having probably for about 3 years now. And while David was still pastoring at Bethany First and I was working on my dissertation, we began this, and I'd like to bring this into a conversation that we could all have together. There's no way in the world we can, the best we're going to hit the edge of the iceberg on this. And so I'll give a way you can get more information at the end of this. But let me just begin by explaining a little bit of the background. one of the most surprising shifts and changes in mission over the last 5 to 10 years has been this move toward congregations engaging in long-term partnerships. And although this it's surprising, not because it's something that is out of the blue, but that short-term missions has been happening, and there's also been this emerging missionary ecclesiology where congregations have been engaging as a whole congregation in missions. But there's several reasons why this is surprising. First, it's surprising because this movement, both in the Church of the Nazarene and beyond, has emerged primarily since 2007, 2008. Right at the point of the financial crisis, we have a large number of congregations that are engaging and giving more to missions than they did before all the financial crisis happened. And that's a surprising part of that. And another factor that's really surprising is how fast this has emerged. And partly because it's emerged so quickly, it's hard to really get a good grasp on completely describing it because we're right in the middle right now of congregations that are trying to engage in these partnerships. And so that's where we're at right now. So what I would like to do is begin by just showing you a little bit. I did a survey recently in the Church of the Nazarene. Actually, this was 2010. And I sent out a survey to all the Nazarene congregations of over 500. And I got a 49% return rate, which is very high when you do this type of research and very reliable. And I asked the question, does your congregation participate in an international partnership with a specific world area outside the United States? And I define partnerships as being mainly development-oriented, but also in church development-oriented. And I was surprised. I knew a few churches that were engaging in this, but I was shocked to find over 40 or 47% said yes. We are currently engaged in a long-term partnership of this type. And that was enormous. Another thing, when I asked those, do you anticipate forming a long-term partnership outside the U.S. in the next 5 years, those who said no to that, you see a large number who said, yes, we anticipate doing that. And also we saw that most of these have started just in the past since 2008, really when all of the financial crisis was happening. And just a few big picture observations. One is that mission giving and interest in the Church of the Nazarene has not gone down in the last 5 years, but if anything, it's dramatically increased, but it's changed. Instead of all the mission giving going through one source, such as the World Evangelism Fund, churches are engaging in these partnerships that are engaging much more money and resourcing much more money than before. And there's also a shift away from congregations viewing missions as supporting the denominations program to a desire that the denominations program support congregations in mission. And that's a major shift. And also just to note that the current shift represents a potential for renewal of the church's identity as the body of Christ. That it's a way that the church is saying, this is our identity. We are people of mission, and so they're seeking ways to do that. In my research, after I did this, I was thinking, there's something going on here, something that's starting at the grassroots that most people aren't even aware of, that this huge surge toward partnerships. So I started a case study at Bethany First Church, and for me, it was kind of a surprising way that I even came into this. I happened to be going through Bethany to drop my daughter off at college, and I walked into Bethany First on a Sunday morning, and everything seemed normal about the service. And David Busick that morning delivered a message that everybody I interviewed nearly 200 people, but everyone from Bethany First, I said, what moved you to be engaged in this partnership? Every one of them pointed back to this sermon of that Sunday morning. Over 400 people in 3 years' time participated in this partnership. Millions of dollars was leveraged. So I'd like to just bring David in on this part of the conversation because he was the one involved in that. A little bit of what went into even that message that morning, and why you would do something as risky as you did to engage Bethany First into this type of a partnership.
Well, it began, David, with just a real passion that I had and concern about HIV and AIDS around the world. I mean, I think we all know it's one of the greatest humanitarian crises in the world today. More than 25 million people have already died of this disease, and right now there are 40 million people living with HIV and AIDS, and 28 million just in sub-Saharan Africa. And that's just the documented cases we have. And that really the Lord really began to speak to me about that. And as I was praying about that one day, I just felt prompted to call a friend of mine who works in compassionate ministries. And I said, what can a local church do to make an impact on this crisis in the world? And he said something very interesting. He said, I just returned even yesterday from Swaziland. And Swaziland, of course, for me in the Church of the Nazarene is kind of mission legend. And when we think about the Smells and Baugh family, and I remember hearing stories for years about the Nazarenes in Swaziland. And so I was immediately interested. He said, you may not know this, but Swaziland has the highest HIV/AIDS infection rate in the world today. 42% of the population are considered to have the disease. And that's a government ratio, and so the odds of that being even higher is greater. And not only that, we discovered that what that did is that the folks who were dying in Swaziland were primarily those from about 18 on up to 45 or 50, and so the ones who were surviving were children and the elderly, which meant the economy was completely devastated and decimated. And then he said to me, the orphan children population in Swaziland is extremely high. There could be 25% of the population under the age of 18 who has no parents. And that the Lord really began to use that and speak to us. And so I began to talk to some leaders in our church and say, we need to address this. And I believe God has opened up a door for us. And so I began that with a sermon just to challenge our people that morning. And I said things like 8,000 people die per day. AIDS has already killed more people than all the plagues and all the famines and all the natural disasters and wars in the entire history of the world. And that the vast number of people who have AIDS today are women and children. There's some cultural issues that we may want to discuss later on of why that's true. But that 14,000 people are infected every day, or basically one person is infected every time you take a breath. The United Nations estimates that in the next decade, 89 million people will become infected with AIDS. And sub-Saharan Africa, as I mentioned, has 10% of the world's population. They have 70% of the AIDS cases. And so 1 in 5 kids in Swaziland are an orphan. And I just began to share those facts and those statistics and talked about what the church was called to do. And David, I had no idea the impact. I mean, I felt like it was important to say, but I literally had no idea what that was going to do in the life of our congregation.
Yeah. I think it was fascinating. One of the comments you made in the sermon, you said the AIDS epidemic is the greatest crisis of our day, but it's also the greatest opportunity for the church to be the church in a world that thinks the church will not show up. And you said, what are we going to do about this? I was studying the congregation. I remember various people looking at each other, and I think everyone felt like I did. We felt we've got to do. The church has to respond to this, to be who we are as a church. But really, left at a place was how does the church do this? And that's a huge thing for one. You know, even Bethany First is a large congregation with a lot of resources. But, you know, there's been a lot of other people with a lot of resources that have tried to address things like this and have not been successful. It's been disaster. You know, in Swaziland, I'd read some reports a few years earlier of people who have tried to do that with a lot of resources. And so it was a fascinating thing for me to see, because I walked away kind of excited but skeptical at the same time. You know, is this going to be a colonialist type of approach that we're going to go and fix Swaziland? Or is it really going to be a joint partnership? And really discovered a mixture, but really positive things that why the infrastructure and the past of Swaziland helped facilitate that whole thing.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the two basic responses the church has when they're dealing with something overwhelming like AIDS that the whole world is trying to address is, number one, we just kind of feel like it's hopeless. There's nothing we can do, and we can pray, but what can one church do to really impact that? I think the other thing is that we kind of bury our heads a little bit, and we're watching television, and a commercial comes on talking about that. We immediately leave it because we just think we can't handle that. You know? Or, as you said, the church sometimes will become colonial, and I think what we mean by that is we go thinking we're going to bring our ideas and our solutions and our money to the problems, and we will fix them. We will help them think like us, worship like us, and be the church like us, and somehow that by bringing our principles and cultural ideas to them, that's really all they need. And when the truth is that the church in Swaziland was doing all the right things. They were doing everything they knew to do. They needed someone to come alongside and not to tell them what to do, but to say, we are with you. Yeah. We're taking your hand, and we're going to walk through this together. And so, rather than give our ideas to you, what is God leading you to do that we can help with? Sure.
If I can just interject a question as we kind of go through here. I have a couple of them, but one of them to David Busick. Kind of your statement in your sermon is that this is the greatest opportunity for the church to be the church, and I, in a world that thinks the church is not going to show up, and I guess I'm just curious how you tied that in even theologically that morning. I mean, I think we can all really resonate with that, but we also live in a world that says, well, how much church should you be involved in social, or are you going to become overcome by being involved in social change? So how did you tie that together, and what was sort of the balance of that?
Yeah, one of the very interesting things about not only the church in Swaziland, but even the church there in Bethany, is that part of our DNA as the Church of the Nazarene has always been a holistic view of reaching people. It's obviously our goal is for people to come to Christ and to be transformed by the gospel. But when the city of Bethany began 100 years ago, it began with a church, a school, and an orphanage. And those three institutions are now Bethany First Church, Southern Nazarene University, and the Children's Hospital now, which is a renowned children's hospital in the Midwest. In fact, the strategy in Swaziland, every time a church was begun, or nearly every time, it began with three things around the vision that Smelzenbaugh had, as well as Dr. David Hind and others, that the mission of Jesus was to teach, preach, and heal. So we will always start a church, a school, and a health clinic. And because of those early decisions that were made, that we're going to be holistic in the way that we approach the gospel. It's not enough just to say, come to Christ, but we will help you with the deep, broken needs that you're facing. That's true for all of us, but because that was true there was such a network in place that it was just very natural to come in to what God had already planted years and years before and join them in the work.
And then, David Wesley, just one other question for you in this sort of introductory part, and that is, you did surveys of churches of 500 and larger. Mm-hmm. And there would be a lot of Nazarene churches that would not fit into that category. Sure. Of that size. Although probably 500 and larger, there was even a great spread, even in size there. So, and you may be getting to this a little bit later, but I think as we move on, do you have hope for those who might be in smaller churches to be able to be a part of of a picture like this?
Yeah, I since I have done this research, I've had a lot of pastors and different people, and a lot of them from churches of 100 to 150 in that area that are beginning different types of partnerships. It looks different. Every partnership looks different. One, it's based on a lot more than any other mission effort in the past. Is a senior pastor has a vital role in it, in that vision, but also the resources that are within the congregation. Bethany First had a lot of medical people and a lot of other resources that shaped this around what was needed in Swaziland. But the other churches are engaged in different types. Some of those are simple, very simple partnerships. I've talked to one in Kenya, and it's other places. Some are even within the United States that they're developing different types. But it's a way to move their whole congregation in partnering with another part of the world. And it's not so much we're going to go and do things for you. How do we engage in mission together? And how do we bring our different resources together for a common mission? I'd like to. I've got a group of best practices, and let me see. Yeah, I'm going to go past some of these slides here and move straight to these aspects of healthy partnerships, which would apply across the board. This should apply to smaller or larger. And just as a side note, I do know that there are some districts, and some people in this webinar may be more familiar with this than I am, but I know there are some districts, as a whole district, that are starting to engage in partnerships, which is, I think, a very healthy, or clusters of churches. But here's some aspects. In my research and everything, these are just a few aspects of healthy partnerships that I noticed. The first is healthy partnerships have a common agenda. This is a shared vision for a change with a common understanding of the problem and a joint approach to solving it through agreed-upon actions. If you note, I've bolded the word common and joint through this. In the case of Swaziland, Bethany First knew some things they wanted to do, but people in Swaziland also knew some things that they needed to do in their own context. And when I interviewed people in Swaziland, they said, this partnership is addressing AIDS, but something was unexpected, I think, from Bethany, was that it was also bringing a healing from some past hurt they had had, and that it was part of the common agenda that started to arise for both sides. And also, how are we going to approach this? There are some things that Swaziland said, this isn't really what we want to do. Some people at Bethany were very excited about it, but they said, this really isn't what we want to do. And incredible, a lot of people from Bethany had a good reverse gear, and they said, okay, this is fine. We'll back away from this. And that together they developed a common agenda. That implies, sufficient time is spent at the beginning to define the nature of the partnership, including a plan for the lifespan of the partnership and mutual accountability. Just to clearly define at the beginning, how are we going to move along, how we're going to make decisions as we move along, and how are we going to be mutually accountable? It's not just one side accountable to the other, but how are we both mutually accountable to the joint mission that we're a part of? Yeah, David.
To that point, David, one of the first things that we did was we knew we had to go in. We thought we knew what the needs were, but we knew we had to go in and listen first, and that was one of your points. And one of the things that I think we have to keep reinforcing in all these partnerships is communicate.
Yeah.
You just when you think that you're communicating and everything's clear, that's probably when it's just beginning.
Yeah.
Because the cultural differences are so vast that mannerisms and customs and ways of thinking and paradigms are drastically different. One's not right, one's not wrong. It's just they're very, very different. And so not only did we have to go through and communicate with those who are helping oversee global mission to be sure that we were not interfering in a place we shouldn't, we also had to go right to the leaders there, the local and district leaders in Swaziland, and be sure that we were talking to each other.
Good. Yeah. That's key. And I just want to throw in here, having a cultural broker, someone who can communicate between the two, is a vital part of that. Second is healthy partnerships have mutually reinforcing activities, or reciprocity. That's where both sides are learning from one another. That implies that teaching and learning is more than one directional. that intentional efforts are made to avoid paternalism and dependency, where one part, just because one part has most of the funds, that doesn't mean they necessarily have all the voice in what happens. That relationships are vital. More important than getting a project done is the relationships that are built through the process.
Right.
Number 3, healthy partnerships work toward clear, quality communication, which David's already mentioned, between all partners. And that communication happens, and just when you think something is understood, come back and clarify. Because when you cross cultures, what you think you said and what you think is understood isn't always the case. That implies consistent, open communication, which builds trust, assumes mutual objectives, and appreciates mutual motivation. And B, the need for cultural brokers. That's people who can navigate communication. In Bethany First case, they had someone for a year that was there that would help communicate between both sides. And that's vital because you can go in for a short meeting and you think everything's agreed upon, but you need someone there to see that in a larger sense.
David, I think one of the best things that we were able to do, and I know not every church can do this, but I think it just helped us so much to understand that by having someone on the ground that was there representing us, not only were they communicating back to us, but they were a physical, tangible, daily reminder to the people in Swaziland that we were with them. We were not leaving them; we were living with them, and so it wasn't just to broker cultural exchanges. It really had to do, as you mentioned a minute ago, with the importance of relationships, and that we're not just here to get something done. We're here to be brothers and sisters in Christ.
Yeah, and that's vital. Let me just wrap up here, and then we'll give some space for questions if we have time here. Is healthy partnerships focus on God's mission, and that's seeing the bigger picture. That is an explicit connection to the larger vision of mission, connecting to partnership activities and local mission involvement, and an intentional effort to help participants integrate their experience with their work and life. That means that as people go on these trips, it should connect to what's happening to them locally. As people go back to their local church, how does this connect to what we're doing locally? So I'm going to turn this back to you, Carla, and if we have any other dialogue that we need to have, since I've kind of zipped through this quickly.
Well, actually, you've done a great job of kind of giving us the overview, and, you did skip over some slides. I'm just wondering, do you want to go back and fill us in on a little of those details back there?
I can't do that, so let's see here.
I think we might enjoy some of that.
Yeah.
Also, if I could just put in a reminder, if you have any questions that you would like to pose to this conversation, that I'm watching those, and we would love to engage them in the conversation, so please feel free to join in on those and throw in any questions that you might have.
Okay. And, if you agree, disagree, or you just want to clarify something, feel free. Some of the major findings of Bethany First was, and I've already mentioned this, the key role of the pastor, and this is different than other short-term mission efforts. Work and witness and other things like that are usually driven by, individuals in the church that have a passion to do work and witness. In partnerships, it's the senior pastor, the key pastor is a vital role in this. And the good thing is that connects to the whole church. The danger of that is when your pastor changes and someone else has to take on, that vision that's happening. And the second, I like to bring David in on this conversation, is the whole church impact. How does this impact the whole congregation? And in Bethany First, I found that this was woven through every part of the church. So
and this is really directed to our listeners right now and our participants, and that is to say, I would just highly recommend that when you're thinking about any kind of partnership, that you distinguish it from work and witness. Work and witness has been a wonderful ministry in the Church of the Nazarene, and it's helped a lot of places. But I think the people's image of work and witness is that they're swinging a hammer, and that if they can't do construction, that maybe it's not for me, which basically eliminates about 95% of your congregation from participating outside of giving and praying, but they're not into building buildings. And one of the things that we did to try to include the whole church, realizing this is a long-term partnership, is that we changed the name from Work and Witness to GO teams, G-O teams, Global Outreach teams, that said whatever God has gifted you with, whatever your strengths are, you can use them here in Swaziland. If you're a doctor or a nurse, there's a way to use that gift and talent in Swaziland. If you're an educator, if you're a computer technician, if you want to play soccer with kids, if you want to rock AIDS babies, whatever it is, compassion, that there's a place for you. And the more we open that up to say, God's gifted you to be a part of this mission and this partnership, that's when things begin to explode. That's when ideas begin to flow. And the permission was given, and it was, to keep using these metaphors, the dam burst. And all of a sudden, it was far, far bigger than just a pastoral vision. It became a vision that the whole church shared.
Yeah. And I was shocked as I interviewed people. I would have them bring things from this partnership, and people would lean across the table. And I told them it would be an hour interview, and these are people, professionals. They have a lot going on, and they just want to keep on going and going and going. And as they brought these artifacts, they would bring like pictures of what I said. What is it that represents this partnership? And they would bring pictures. They would bring things that they made. And a fascinating thing at Bethany First is, and through the survey, I found that, I thought when I did the survey, I asked the question, does this mean that you have cut off paying any WEF spending in order to do this partnership? And I just saw John Calhoun had asked a question about how this affects WEF, and maybe David could address this, but I was shocked that both Bethany First and most of the churches, they weren't cutting back on WEF. They saw WEF as the infrastructure, but they were adding on to this. I don't know.
Yeah, one of the very first decisions that we made is that this was not going to mean we were trying to give less. This was about giving and extending ourselves more. And it was a great relief to our people to know that this long-term partnership did not mean that we weren't going to be supporting the church in China, or we weren't going to be supporting the church in other places of the world that they were deeply committed to. Bethany First had always been a mission-minded church, but we said this is all over and above WEF, World Evangelism Fund. We're going to continue to do what we've been doing. We're going to continue to support the work around the world. But if this is going to succeed, it's going to mean that we have to do more than we've been doing. And I shouldn't have surprised me, but what fascinated me was that we gave a lot more with this partnership than we had ever given before in the middle of a down economy. And the participation was more wide. I mean, rather than just have a lot of folks who were older and more traditional Nazarenes who were involved in giving, in mission-type giving, now we had children giving. Now we had youth giving. We had college students giving. People who had never thought about missions before, suddenly there was this broad expanse of ownership from the whole congregation.
Yeah. And it was fascinating. As I interviewed some people, I said, how does this affect the children in your church? And they said it was incredible because the children, all of a sudden, they were praying for Swazi leaders by name. And they would see pictures in the services of people and their parents or their pastors in Swaziland. And so it became much more real to them, which was a fascinating thing. Just on that, number third on the major findings there, one thing, and this is, there's something, most what I found was positive. Some things were things that were growing edges. And since Bethany First was a pioneer in doing this, there were learning edges to it. And one of it was people were greatly, greatly impacted by Swaziland, but they really struggled with how do they connect what happened in Swaziland to how they live in Bethany when they got back. I would ask them, how does this affect how you look at others who are either economically different or ethnically different or whatever when you return back to Bethany? And they really struggled. They wanted to do something, but they had a hard time connecting those dots. And so there was a great need that I found to develop more intentional ways when people got back to say, so what? What does this mean as I engage in mission in my everyday life? So it's not just mission isn't just something that happens short term when I go to Swaziland, but it's something that affects my whole life.
Let me, you have addressed some of the questions that are coming up, but let me just sort of couch it in this way. We talked about WEF and, people continuing to give to WEF, but then the question about does it distract from, kind of the wider picture of what we're doing in missions. I think what I'm picking up from you all is actually this experience enhances the desire to be involved in global mission, because it seems like there's something about getting to tie that down tangibly to some kind of place and event that makes us go, aha, I understand what this whole mission thing in the Church of the Nazarene is about. Would you let either one of you kind of expound upon that a little bit more?
Yeah, go ahead, David.
I think for the first time in a long time, missions took on a face for the people of Bethany First Church. It wasn't just a group of people far away across oceans that we needed to help, but now these were our friends. These were people that we were in relationship with, and we knew their names, we knew their stories, we knew their heartaches, we knew their victories, and all of a sudden they became family, because it wasn't just we fly in, we're there for 10 days, we fly out. We built a little building, or we built a building, and then we had a little vacation, but now we're home and we're thinking about the next trip. No, now we're thinking about this partnership every single day. And I can't describe how much it has impacted not just the mission giving of the church, but the mission mindset, even locally, to begin to think, why are we not doing this with people right next door? And maybe we do. Maybe it's not just about flying in next door and trying to help that in the soup kitchen, but maybe it has something to do with the relationships we have in these neighborhoods.
One way I noted the shift and the change is before we've often thought of missions as a program. It's a program we support. But to me, this has moved more to a relational type of focus. It's kind of like when I first started dating my wife, I didn't have any money, but I fell in love, and I would, I wanted to buy something for her, and I would find funds to do it. If I didn't have it, I would go borrow from someone or do something. And it's kind of what's happening in these partnerships. People are falling in love with other people that they never knew before. And out of that, giving is not something, well, we have to raise this certain amount of fund to support our program. This is saying, I have a relationship with these people, and that's why the conversation is completely different. It's not like, how do we support this structure or this program, but we are engaged with these people. And I think there's something very theological about the way we understand the Trinity and how we understand ourselves as a people who are relational people through that. And to me, it's a reviving of our identity of what it means to be the body of Christ. And it's an exciting piece. So.
Well,
now to you, Carla.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think we'd like to invite Jim Koppel into this conversation. I think he's got some questions he'd like to bring to us. So I think, and I'm going to ask Dr. David Busick to introduce him, and I think they're going to work on how to get him into our conversation here.
I didn't know Jim was going to be in on this, but I'm glad that he is, because Jim Koppel and Colleen Koppel have been a major partner with us in the whole Swaziland partnership. In fact, Tom Neese, some of you may know Tom Neese, first began to hear about our interest in Swaziland, and he also knew that Jim and Colleen Koppel had an interest in Swaziland, and so he brought us together for a meeting. He introduced us. I remember sitting in my office, and Jim across the table, Tom across the table. Jim said 2 minutes worth of things, and then Jim and I talked for the next hour and a half and developed a deep friendship. But Jim's expertise, not only in the area of fundraising, but in capacity building in places around the world, has been indispensable, and there's no way to measure the impact that Jim's expertise has had on helping us to know how to work with governments, how to work with issues of culture, And so welcome, Jim. It's great to have you in the conversation.
And I think we might be working on technically exactly how we're getting him in here. And so we might have a minute. I think they're going to let me know when he's actually in here. But we would like to, and as that's happening, I think let me just build on this relationship model that David Wesley was talking about. And that is this relationship with Jim Koppel. You know, that it's amazing how when we begin to sort of move into God's flow into the world, that these relationships develop and that God takes us into these relationships with people that help things happen at a level that we did not expect. In other words, there's a synergy that happens, that my willingness to engage in this brings us together. Dave Wesley, did you want to talk about that?
I just put on a slide, and I don't have time to really go into this completely, but really the major finding I had from this research is what I call collective impact. And I'll give you my email if you're interested in the further documents on this. But this particular partnership, you can see in this where there was more overlap from Bethany First, the denomination, the Swaziland networks, and then other networks that are completely outside the Church of the Nazarene, including Coca-Cola, the Koppels, and what they were doing on grant writing and everything. But where all those came together was the greatest impact. If you were to add together all the impact each one made, it was much less than where they overlapped and where they worked together. And that was a major finding. And for the denomination, the region there, they became one part that negotiated into that. Instead of funneling it and controlling, they were one of the partners, and that made it healthier. And that was a big difference between other partnerships in the past that have tried to work in Swaziland. But that whole piece of collective impact was major.
Jim, are you there with us?
I think so. Can you hear me? I can hear you.
Yeah, I think, Jim, you're coming to us all the way from Nairobi today, aren't you?
That's correct. I'm in Nairobi, Kenya.
All right.
We're in the process of executing one of these kinds of.
I think you're probably talking to us from your Skype, and there's a little bit of stuff happening there. I do just want to mention one of the people that's on. Scott Mapes mentioned that, Jim, that you were a professor at ENC when he was a student there, and you had a great impact on them and his life even at that period of time. So thank you for that. And, Jim, maybe because of a little bit of the distortion stuff, we're going to just let you talk a little bit, and maybe if you have some questions, and then we'll respond back. So we'll turn it over to you.
Well, I really don't have too much to say. I think the two Davids have done a great job in presenting the backdrop and the background. I think the exciting part about this partnership and what the lessons learned from David Wesley's research is moving us outside of our smaller communities and into the broader world, and being able to connect the gospel to create a faithful presence, lifting up the Lord Jesus Christ in all these situations and circumstances, not only with the direct beneficiaries, but with the partners. I mean, the Coca-Cola Corporation, USAID, the Center for Disease Control, were all organizations that were affected by the witness of the church. When the ambassador of Swaziland said the U.S. ambassador to Swaziland said in one of our meetings when we introduced ourselves, he said, "I love the Church of the Nazarene. You guys are everywhere." And I think that's a testimony to the kind of power that these partnerships can demonstrate. You know, I'm here in Kenya working on a similar partnership with the Crossroads Church of the Nazarene in Phoenix, where we're doing the Kenya Gender-Based Violence Prevention Initiative. And the testimony of African Nazarene University, the testimony of the church, of people who have been here, is really having an impact not only on the beneficiary, but also on our partners such as UNICEF and the International Refugee Committee. So I'll stop there because I don't know if you can hear everything I'm saying, but I just want to validate what the two Davids have said. And this is pioneering work, and I also truly believe that it's work that's not just restricted to the large church or the church over 500, but districts and smaller congregations can engage in similar partnerships.
Well, Jim, thank you. We really appreciate it, and we appreciate your help in putting so many pieces together. I also want to just say to this group, this is a Club 300 meeting and gathering today, which has been very greatly facilitated by the work of Jim Koppel, and so thank you for everything that you're doing, whether it's for the partnerships in Africa, around the world, or even here at NTS. So, and thanks for joining us all the way across the ocean from Africa. Go ahead, David Busick.
I'm talking about partnerships and how the synergy comes together. When we don't try to control these partnerships, I mean, control usually ends up killing partnerships if one or the other has an agenda that is dominating. But when control is released to say, let's let God do what God wants to do in this situation, it's the potential and the open doors are just limitless. And to give you an example of that, there was a man in our church who went on the first Go team. He was an engineer, and we went into a community that was devastated by poverty. It was the entire place had no water. A valley of 7,000 people had no clean water, and they had to walk miles and miles to do that. And that's our first place, was to work at a clinic and a church and a school in a place called Sitsatsawini. And this man from our church named Fred, he was there watching all of this, and he noticed in the schoolyard there was a water well windmill that was broken down, and that's what you see in a lot of these partnerships. You see things that have been brought in at some place. We brought it in, we put it in, but nobody knew how to run it. It broke down. The infrastructure of the country can't support it, and there it was, a water well, but no water. Fred said, Pastor David, I think I'm going to go look at that water well and see if there's water. And he went and began to investigate it over the course of 2 or 3 days. He came back and he said, I know there's water there. We just can't get it out. And he began to do investigating in local villages to see if anyone could fix that. And because he couldn't find that, he went back home, used his expertise, developed a model for a new solar water well system that would not break down, that would not be dependent on electricity and infrastructure, that wouldn't need to have any kind of maintenance done, but that could pump water out of that well. He brought it back. It was about a $25,000 well, and that's exactly what happened. I went back to that community the next year, and where there had been dead fields and no grass and animals starving to death, now there was green, there were crops, there was running water, and that happened because of a man named Fred in our church. Now, the amazing thing about the partnership is, in the synergy, Coca-Cola Foundation, who was sponsoring water projects in Africa, found out about this solar well and asked if they could reproduce that, and committed $1 million to solar well projects across South Africa and in Swaziland specifically. And we said, we'll do that with one caveat, and that is that you start with the 17 Nazarene clinics around Swaziland, and today every Nazarene clinic in Swaziland has fresh running water. And because a man named Fred Evans in our church had a vision, was given the blessing to do what God's gifted you to do, and the partnership of Coca-Cola came in and made a huge impact.
Just to pick up on this point, this is really one of the best examples of this collective impact, because you had Bethany first using some resources in Fred that was there, but you also had Jim Koppel and Coca-Cola who picked up on that, connected that to Coca-Cola, and they also tied to that whole Nazarene infrastructure that was already in place. When I was interviewing through several of these places where they had the water wells, I sat down, I think I've got, let me see here just a second, I've got a slide. It's kind of the background of that slide, but I was interviewing these 3 women there in one of the places where they had that. And the church, Bethany First, had just put in the water well and some things with Coca-Cola funds. And I was interviewing them about the use of that water. I said, I noticed you have various water spigots throughout, some for gardens and everything, but there was one spigot particularly that was outside the fence. And I said, aren't you afraid that people from the community are going to come up and use up all your water? And one of the women there, she took my hands and she laughed at me. She said, you know, you need to understand we're Christians. And as Christians, we didn't make the water. It's God's water, and it's a gift to us. And the fact that that was tied to a church, that church served that whole community. And so that collective impact, the fact that it was tied to the infrastructure of the church, it moved beyond, and so it served the whole community because the people in the churches understood this is part of their Christian identity and what they do, which I think was a very powerful piece and fit very well with, you know, African philosophy of what's called Ubuntu, that I am because of who we are. Our collective identity together as Christians is the most important piece. So.
Thank you very much. We have another question that's come up here, and I'm going to pose it to David Busick. Just a question of when we partner with secular entities, or have we ever been pressured to modify or avoid spreading the gospel? And if such pressure is found, what is our response to that pressure?
That's a great question. We did not find a lot of opposition from some of the secular entities that we've been working with. In fact, it's almost like they had been surprised that we would ask them to join us in work like this. We brought in eye doctors, eye specialists, dental specialists, people that have given hospital equipment from all kinds of places. And even the government of Swaziland has been very, very open to say, if you can help our people, we know what you do, we know who you are, we know what your message is, but if you can help our people, we'll be supportive of that. However, it's absolutely true that anytime you're in a partnership, there will be some who will want to leverage their own agenda, and at times that agenda can compromise the gospel and our message. And I actually learned this from Jim Koppel. Jim has been very clear in his expertise over the years to say that if you don't know what your mission is when a check is being waved in your face, it's going to be easy to compromise. You have to know what you're willing to do and not do way ahead of time before the pressure of seeing resources. And I found that to be great advice. And, of course, we know what our mission is. I would also say, though, that maybe there are times where we have confused the mission with the methods. And I think the Nazarenes across 100 years have been true to this. As long as the methods don't compromise the message, we ought to be flexible, open, and creative. That's been a part of the Nazarene DNA from the very beginning. And so we need to be sure we know what the mission is and the message is, but if it's not compromising that, let's open our arms and take in these partnerships.
One of the exciting things that this partnership did, and part of this question is, how about the spread of the gospel and that type of thing, is Bethany First really didn't go in and do most of the evangelizing, but what it did is it gave credibility to the Christians in Swaziland. The people around them saw that they were like the church is putting the water well available to the community. That became a great credibility piece for them, and so it gave the church a credible voice. And person after person I interviewed in Swaziland, they said this has given a great increase in evangelism and the church growing in Swaziland because it's given greater credibility to their Christian witness.
I might add one more thing, Carla and David, just to that point, and that is what we have learned from the Swazi people has been as great or greater than anything we have brought to them. Their courage, their commitment, their consecration, their willingness to serve. We have learned things about what it means to be Christian and what it means to be the church in so many ways. We went into a church that rather than say, we're going to curse this darkness, this was a church in Swaziland who was going into the places where no one else would go and doing what nobody else would do, and they were serving the dying and taking children. We went into literal huts where Nazarene mothers had 18 to 20 children that they had brought in, even though they could barely support their own kids. They were bringing these children in. We saw the church organizing themselves around going into people who were dying of AIDS that most people had forgotten and written off. They were coming in, they were bathing them, cleaning their house, bringing them food, praying with them, offering them hope and compassion. And those were lessons that I knew I would find, but I just want to remind us all, the partnerships, in order for there to be reciprocity, the learning has to be going both ways.
Exactly.
I do want to say we want to be sensitive to people's time today, so we're going to be working at kind of wrapping this up a little bit. If you have more questions, and I know we haven't addressed them all yet, and we will here, but if you have any more questions you want to throw into that Q&A section, I'll be looking at that. Jim Koppel from Africa, I think you had another comment you wanted to add here to the conversation. Jump in.
Actually, David just summarized it quite well. I mean, in answer to the question, we should never compromise who we are, what our mission is, or sell it for any price. But you need to know what you stand for when you're working with a partner, and to be very clear about that. We've actually found in many of these partnerships that our message, our mission, and our approach is welcomed by secular partners. It's been an amazing journey to see that kind of transformation, and I'll leave it there to let others ask questions.
Well, and so I have a question to the two of you that you might be able to respond to, and it kind of can be wrapped in together. One is, how dependent are these partnerships upon a broker, somebody that can actually broker these partnerships? And then there was a question specifically about whether Bob Prescott on the East Coast was still a resource and possibly a broker to help with some of these partnership opportunities. So maybe go to David Wesley.
Yeah, the whole idea of brokers, and I have on my Dropbox, if anybody wants the information, I put the note on that, an article on what's called backbone organization. You need to have somebody who can negotiate and who has the interest of both sides in mind, and so you can bring everyone to the table to discuss. At Bethany, there were several things that I followed, but the ones that were most successful were the ones where they had a broker in the middle that understood the culture of the church or the congregation, and they also understood the mission of the area where they were working, and they understood both sides and communicate very well. I really can't speak real well to a whole lot to what I know. Bob Prescott's working in Cuba and several other areas, facilitating some things. I think that role is somewhat of a broker role, but I don't know. And so right now, like I said when I began, a lot of this is developing very quickly, and I know we have a lot of learning to do in the process, but that broker role is probably one of the key learning edges, and I think a lot of missionary roles are moving more and more to being broker roles, where they don't go, used to we just go in and learn the culture and start churches and things, but now it's how do we collect and move things together so that the church can work interdependently.
I know that was part of our role, at least we felt that way in the former Soviet Union, and we saw that developing more and more that way, and to be this bridge between bringing the sides together. And I do think that Bob Prescott does continue to fit in that role. I mean, I think that he provides that. David Wesley, would you be able to share with us a little bit about the material? Just to say, unfortunately, I mean, we haven't even scratched the top of what David Wesley's research really has been about. We're just getting a little tiny flavor of it. And I know there's so much more that you have to offer. And I think you put some documents in a Dropbox or something. And so could you share with us a little bit about what else you are making available to this group?
Yeah, I put in Dropbox, let me look real quick. I put actually my dissertation I have in there. If you have problems sleeping at night, that may help you out a little bit. But I have that, and what I can do, if you want access to that Dropbox, just send me an email, and I'll put you in that. But it also includes, my email is dwesley@nts.edu. I put that on the conversation link. But I also have on there a copy of David Busick's original sermon. which I think will be interesting to see the pastor's role in this. I have a copy of what I presented to Bethany first as my report to them. I'm still working on a report to the Africa region and to Swaziland that I can include in this. I have videos, pictures, a lot of things, odds and ends that came out of my research, but also some documents that I have started to develop describing collective impact and describing how that can be applied more to mission. And so just have various things. If you want to dig into this a little further, which I would encourage you to do, I'm hoping more people pick up and say, okay, how do we move forward in a healthy way that the whole church can engage in the whole mission that we have around the world? And I think more than ever in our history, we're standing on a time right now to think that instead of just saying, how do we support a few people that do missions, we have key people who are bridge people that are in missions in very dedicated roles, but how do we move the whole church so that the whole church is engaged in mission? And the potential for impact, the potential for danger is huge as well. The potential of going in and doing destructive things is massive, and I would be the first to say that. But the potential to really address things as huge as HIV/AIDS and things such as gender-based violence, things that we haven't even thought of the church being able to even think of addressing, that gives credibility for the church being the church around the world, is a real potential. And so I think we're at an exciting time in the church that, God's kind of waking us all up to something exciting right now.
David Busick, you have something kind of here that you would like to add, kind of here as we kind of wrap things up a little bit?
I saw a picture not long ago of a turtle walking along a road, and the caption said, "I only move forward when I stick my neck out." And I have a feeling that there's a lot that God wants to do in the church if we have some leaders who are willing to be courageous and step forward and release the people to do God's work. And I'm excited to see how partnerships are going to impact the church.
Well, thank you so much to both of you and for this great information today. I would like to ask that our follow-up question, we have a follow-up feedback survey that's going to be posted here in the Q&A section, and we'd like to ask you to take a moment and look down there and be filling that out. But while you're doing that, there were a couple more questions that we'd like to answer here. Jeremy Scott mentioned that Laura Wooster, she's from out in the ENC region, and she's working under Bob Prescott for church partnerships in the Mesoamerica region. So if you are out there on the East Coast and you might be interested in contacting Laura Wooster and Bob Prescott. So, yes, those are partnerships, and those are people that are working. David Wesley,
Yeah, actually, all the regions right now, Marty Hoskins is at Global Mission has just started working on how Global Mission engages in this. And I know he has people, I was in a couple of meetings, people from every region that are starting to address partnerships. It's still pretty liquid how this is developing, but it looks like there is at least some coordination, not to control partnerships, but to network and facilitate partnerships, which is, I think, is a very healthy move. But every region is so different. Culturally, they're different. Structurally, how they're different. And so it looks like most partnerships right now are negotiated with the regions and the teams on each region.
Very good. Thank you. And again, I just want to ask you, if you don't mind, to be filling out the feedback. We would appreciate that today. We have another question about how do we allow non-participants to access a recording of this webinar. This first webinar we are going to put on the NTS website. It will be available next week. It will be at nts.edu/club-300. I'll put that in the all participants chat section here, so you can see what that URL is. We're going to do that for this first one because we'd like to know if people have enjoyed this and gotten something out of it. But really, it is to be exclusive for Club 300 people. So in the future, I don't think we're going to make that live for others. But for this first one, we'd be happy to share that information. We are just very grateful that you've taken the time to be with us. I think Dr. Busick has some information about our next Club 300 web conference meeting like this.
Yeah, thank you, Carla, for moderating this for us and for your for all the ways you support our alumni. The date is going to be released to you soon, but the next topic that we'd like to use as a webinar is Preaching Holiness in an I-God World. And so talking about what are some ways today that we can talk about the doctrine of holiness in the world we live in today. And I hope that'll be interesting to you, and we'll get that information out quickly to let you know when that next one will be.
Well, on behalf of NTS, I want to thank Dr. Wesley and Dr. Busick today and our audience for taking the time to join us. If you have any questions about the materials presented today that did not get answered, please feel free to email them to the presenters or here to NTS. And again, this webinar recording will be available in the next week. I sent the link there to all participants in the chat box so that you can be seeing that. So thank you for joining us. We look forward to having you at our next event. God bless you.